the moment the guns go silent in Ukraine, that's where the economy will tank.
Having a great army is a sign of a great power.
There are indicators that the economy is not healthy.
Putin has already made his choices, prioritized military over civil one.
Welcome to the Carnegie Politica podcast. I'm Alexandra Gabuev, director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. Today's episode is dedicated to the Russian economy. When Putin ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the core element of the Western response was the sanctions campaign. 3.5 years later, Russia is arguably the most sanctioned economy on earth. Never have such far-reaching restrictions been unleashed so rapidly against such a large economy. Many Western policymakers and analysts say that the economy is Putin's Achilles heel, and that the Kremlin will have to abandon its war against Ukraine this year because of mounting economic challenges at home. Yet, despite the tsunami of sanctions, mounting war spending, and huge losses and damage incurred by Russia in this war, the country's economy is still managing to generate enough cash and war-related materials to continue Putin's offensive. But how long can it last? I'm joined by my colleague Alexandra Prokopenko, who has been on this podcast before. Sasha is one of the most sought-after experts on the Russian economy. Prior to joining Carnegie, she was an economic reporter for major Russian media, covered the Kremlin, and most recently was a senior advisor at the Russian Central Bank before resigning and leaving the country in early 2022. Welcome, Sasha. It's always great to have you back.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
All right, so let's start with trying to zoom out a little bit from the day-to-day reality of the Russian economy. I think that when talking about the strategy on how to navigate this war and bring the conflict to an end that's acceptable for Ukraine and obviously for its supporters in the West, I frequently hear two words in Western capital: the Russian economy. Many decision makers hope that the economy is actually Putin's Achilles heel, and that a contraction or even collapse of the Russian economy is around the corner, if only the West could slap more sanctions and put more pressure. I think that this conversation is in fourth year now, and Russia seems to manage rising costs of this war for now. Why, in your view, and what are the major sources of Russia's economic resilience?
It's a good question, Sasha. We talk multiple times that pillars of Russia's economic resilience and stability are the following. First and foremost, additional spending, both from budget and subsidized credit, which means credit crunch, additional money which were spent into the economy, and the amount of fiscal impulse injected into economy during last 3 years was beyond 10% of GDP, which is enormously big. That's the first and very important. Second, I think what was underestimated is the professionalism of Russian economic team, who was quite capable enough to taking fast, solid, and smart decisions to adjust economy on daily basis to changing environment and into sanctions. Third, the whole structure of Russia's economy, while we all were worried if Russian economy will turn into a planned economy, so back to Soviet Union practices, but no, it's still market economies. The structure of economy is still market, even in a military industry complex. So that also gives economy more resilience. However, there are some indicators suggest that recession is already on the way and economy is starting to cool down after its overheated 2024.
That's very interesting. And before we continue, I would remind all the listeners that we would very much welcome your feedback. So please subscribe to this podcast, hit the subscribe button on the platform that you are receiving your podcast, and write us some comments. We are really eager to hear from you. So you mentioned that there are already signs of contraction, and I cannot agree more. There are indicators that the economy is not healthy. Like the interest rate still stands at 21%, and at the beginning of the year, inflation was in double digits. I remember that in your article you've written for Foreign Affairs in January 23, you describe a reality that the Kremlin is facing, and you call it Putin's impossible trilemma. And your argument is that it's impossible for the Kremlin to maintain simultaneously three things. One is growing military and security expenditures that are now accounting for around 8% of GDP combined and roughly 40% of budget spendings. Second is keeping the population happy through maintaining high social expenditures. And three, to maintain macroeconomic stability. So you can pursue all three at the same time in a short run, but you cannot do that indefinitely. So are we now in year 4 of this horrible war at the point where Putin actually needs to choose and to prioritize something? And what are the choices that the Kremlin is making?
I think he has already made his choices, and Putin has already prioritized military over civil one. So for now, as far as I understand, Russia's authorities has decided that level of military spending, which isn't threatening to the economy. By threat, I mean it doesn't lead to an imminent collapse, is near 6% of GDP solemnly on military and 7% of GDP combined with the expenditures on national defense, which includes spending on different enforcement agencies and penitentiary system. So mandatory social spending is near 6%, 6 or 7, depends on the year. If it's electional year, it's growing. If it's not, it's shrinking. And the remaining expenses will be formed around these constants. So Putin has already made his choices, and military industry complex and army are sucking resources from the civil part of the economy. So it is already not a great situation for robust economic development and sustainable economic development midterm and long term. And I think this situation for Russia's economy will persist for coming at least 3 years in a row, and maybe more, depends on how fast and how lucky Putin will be in terms of restoring its military capacity and to which extent Putin actually wants to restore it. I'm not a military expert, that's unclear to me.
But here is the thing. So some policymakers we're talking to say, oh, it's now impossible for Putin to stop the war overall because he got so dependent on it as an engine for economic growth. And the moment the guns go silent in Ukraine, that's where the economy will tank because there will be no more military expenditures. Do you agree with that view?
No, I disagree. We're not in the situation where the tail wags the dog. So Putin wants to have high military expenditures for 2 reasons. First, and that's his cruel goals, which he's chasing in Ukraine. And second, because I think he believes that restoring military capacity is a sign of a great power. Having a great army is a sign of a great power. If it will damage a civil part of the economy, okay, he will be okay with that. Unlike his Chinese friend, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Putin isn't stick with the figures, and he already signals to the economy, to his economic bloc, that he will be okay if economic growth in 2025 would be lower, significantly lower actually, than it was in 2024. I will remind you that in 2024, the economy grew by 4.3%, and expectations on 2025 is 1.5. And Putin vocally says that he's okay with that. So here, I think there is a consensus among economic bloc that there is no need to increase military spending just to have a great growth figures. Speaking on military industry complex itself, of course, it grew significantly during the last 3 years. And I'm pretty sure that such influential guys like Chemezov don't want to shrink their new area of responsibility and area of influence because of slowdown in military expenditures. But there are objective limitations on the side of our labor force. So even if they will open new facilities, they will struggle to find workers for them. So they couldn't increase significantly output, even if the state will increase spending. And that's actually what we see now in manufacturing. So there is the first natural limitation. And I think Sergei Chemezov, head of Rostec, is a quite realistic guy. And he doesn't look to the economy through pink glasses. And he knows what kind of limitations he has from the inside and to which extent Rostec can increase output. So I don't think that a military industry complex now is a factor for Putin. Moreover, Putin is a factor for military industry complex to work around the clock to soak resources, labor resources, financial resources, and other type from the civil part of the economy because Putin wants them to push, because Putin chasing his goals in Ukraine. I think here's the situation.
So I think that if I'm hearing you correctly, you describe this military expenditures as something similar to a performance-enhancing drug for athletes. So the longer-term fixation on the war is here, and for now, economy seems to be robust and even growing because of this military expenditures. But over a longer time, it's draining the resources out of the system and undermining the healthy future of the Russian economy. So you mentioned some of the key limiting factors on the economy. What are, like, shortage of labor? What are the others? And what are these longer-term stress points for the economy that, if we look around the corner, will materialize at some point down the road?
So for the short-term pressure, I would indicate fiscal pressures and persistent low oil prices or a strong ruble, as we see now. Ruble exchange rate could widen the budget deficit, demanding to spend more from the National Wealth Fund. National Wealth Fund is an important factor both internally and externally. And I need to remind that in 2024, Finmin projected to remain a National Wealth Fund untouchable in 2025. Now they will remove some part of this. Of course, they have a room for placing domestic bonds. But it seems to me that in 2026, because of low oil prices, fiscal consolidation is inevitable. And potentially, Finmin will cut infrastructure spending and budgetary subsidies in industries. As we already discussed, I think that the level of military expenditures will persist at 6 or 7% of GDP. Second factor, which is important short-term and mid-term, is sanctions impact. Sanctions are severely limit access to critical technologies, machinery, and financial markets. They are increasing operational costs and hindering innovations, and they tightening Russia more to China. You know this better than I do, but Russia become more dependent on China, not only in terms of consumer goods or selling oil and gas there, but Chinese manufacturers are replacing assembly lines and different tools for manufacturing in Russia, becoming a real backbone for Russian manufacturing. And a long-term and mid-term development of Russian industry, I think now is impossible without partnership with the Chinese counterparts, which increase already high level of dependency. So another point, as we already discussed, labor shortage and the job market, which is still quite tight. And I don't see any options for Russian government to deal with that. The migration policy is also harsh towards migrants. We don't see this yet on figures of migrants who are coming. But I think 2025, in terms of finding labor for Russian industries, would be tougher than it was before. And I think one of the biggest problems for Russian economy is the prioritization of military and political objectives over economic stability. So this poses a great risk to sustained economic growth. But what is important, that realization of all these risks do not pose an imminent threat to Putin's regime, but it doesn't bring any kind of perks. So without external shocks, the whole situation, well, it preserves, but technologically, Russia rolls back. people's well-being also slowing down, the whole society gradually marginalized because of the rise of criminal and social norms become more murky. There is no perspective of non-oil, non-commodities export for Russian economy because of the cost of the labor and because of the technological deprivation. And Russia become a territory which continue to create problems in terms of security for its neighbors. And in terms of economy, it's still big and it's still attractive for neighboring countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, even like China, but less and less attractive.
And there are many people in the Russian elite that you are talking to still. Officials, bankers, business people. I know that you are finishing a book about this subject and I'm very keen to read it. These people are educated, well-informed. Many are cynical and clear-eyed. They probably do read good analysis, including your work for Carnegie. They cannot be blind to what's happening. How would you describe the mood in Moscow and the outlook on the future of those who have been the major beneficiaries of Putin's rule before the war?
I don't think that we can separate elites and the economy. One is a part of another. Economy changed significantly during the last 3 years, as we just recently discussed. And there appeared a big bunch of people who are direct beneficiaries of the military footage of the economy, of sanctions. And they are quite interested in at least perceiving status quo, the current one. It is not entrepreneurs who appeared from nowhere. Mostly, that's the people who are related to Putin's inner circle and who are now benefiting on rerouting logistics towards east, to China, to Asian countries, or on different schemes, how to circumvent sanctions, how to make transactions, or they're working as financial or logistical intermediaries in the business. It's a big bunch of money. They, of course, don't want to lose it. There's also a big group of people who are now lobbying for protectionism and closing the economy because they became rich on state demand. And of course, they don't want any kind of competitors. Well, and of course, they don't want any kind of competition with the Western companies who potentially can return to Russia's market. So just recently, Putin met with a group of businessmen who asked him to close the market, to adopt a legislation which force foreign companies to drop their buyback options and to close Russian doors for foreign business forever, because otherwise they couldn't win the competition and they don't want to count losses, only profits. So the situation is like a swamp. And lots of people get used to it. I don't see anyone, and I don't meet anyone who really enjoyed the situation, but people adjusted. Of course, I also want to point a growing resentment towards the West, which is bad because originally Russia's elite and Russia culturally saw itself as a part of the Western culture. So this growing resentment is not helping neither to end the war nor to restore ties. But I think the current moment of the situation, which no one likes, actually creates some room for maneuver, which could combine incentives and punishment. Because as we discussed, military will continue to eat resources from the civil, which increase people's unhappiness and shortens profits. Everyone knows that Putin is not forever. So that gives me an option to think that his potential successor wouldn't be welcomed by Russia's elites. And here, I think there is some room for potential discussions, maybe with the Western counterparts.
Final point are options available for Western policymakers. I think that many people have put elevated expectations into the efficiency of the sanctions and have been disappointed. There is this perennial discussion whether the sanctions are working or not. I think that consensus in this team of two Sashas is that we need to define what the word works mean, and they're obviously increasing pain and cost of Russia's persecution of this horrible war in Ukraine. But the frustration is understandable and probably justified. What are the tools that you see as available for the Western policymakers to really make the sanctions more biting, and this moment where Putin really need to make a very painful trade-offs for his rule and his system to be shifted to the left? So this point of pressure on Russia materializes earlier than the projections suggest now.
So first and foremost is enforcement. And here US has more options or more successfully enforced sanctions rather than Europe, but it doesn't mean that Europe cannot increase its capacity to enforce sanctions. At least we now understand that sanctions become more and more ordinary tool. And after Russia, well, I cannot exclude that there will be another country under sanctions. So all these skills in terms of enforcement, all this enforcement infrastructure would be useful in the future, I think. Good news on sanctions is that even if US will withdraw from sanctions or lift or transform its part of sanctions, sanctions imposed by United Kingdom and by European Union will be still in place, and for compliance offices in multinational corporations in the banking system, it's still a factor. So sanctions will remain a curb for Russia's businesses and will continue to put additional transactional costs on Russia's economy. That's why, one more time, enforcement is important. But I think that in terms of sanctions, and I said it already, that the West could become more creative and can consider some sort of options in terms of softening, for instance, capital controls on Russia's money, because there is no trust in Russia to Russian banking system. And there is a lot of money which would likely be withdrawn if these options existed. And this will damage Russia's economy from the inside. And this also create a political risk because central bank and Russian government would be forced to stop capital outflow. But this would be not a result of sanctions, the result of a policy from the cruel Western partners, but this would be a result of a policy of domestic central bank or the government, which creates more unhappiness and more anger within the country. I think stimulation of brain drain from Russia also would be helpful. So potentially, I think that considering restoration of student exchanges and research exchanges and all kind of scientific collaboration, it will distract a huge bunch of educated people who are now locked within the country. It will distract from Putin's system and from Russia's science to the globe, which will, at the end, profiteering to the global economy and to Western economies rather than they will locked in Russia and continue to work on Russia because they have no other options.
Thank you, Sasha. It was always great having you, and to be continued.
Thank you, Sasha.
That's it for today. If you don't want to miss any new episode, please feel free to hit the subscribe button on the platform you receive your podcast. And again, we are also very much looking forward to receive your feedback and comments. Carnegie Politica Podcast will be back in 2 weeks. Goodbye.